Okay, good morning, everybody. I am showing 9 o'clock on the dot. Welcome to today's webinar, Indicator 13, What LEAs Need to Know for Cyclical Monitoring for Continuous Improvement. My name is Hillary Mangus, and I work with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network on the Secondary Transition Initiative. My co-presenters for today are Ryan Romanowski from our Harrisburg office in the Central Region and Kim Cole from our office in the Eastern Region. As a reminder, if you are on this Zoom today, you should be representatives from those local education agencies who will be participating in cyclical monitoring for continuous improvement as identified on a July 5, 2019 Penn link. At this time, I want to take you to the Patent website to show you where you can access the handouts for today's webinar. Ryan, can you switch? There you go. So if you go on to the Patent website, you want to go up to the top left-hand corner where it says Training Calendar and go to today's date, September 13th. And you're going to click on the link for today's webinar. And under Event Files on the right side, you'll see the 3 links for the handouts. So one will be the PowerPoint for today. One will be our 2019 Indicator 13 checklist. And the third will be a file review guide that will walk you through the tools for today. In addition, we ask that you have with you for today on hand a copy of a student IEP with invitation from within your LEA, because at times during today's webinar, we will be having you go through that file review guide and Indicator 13 checklist to check your IEP for compliance. So let's go through a little bit of logistics. If you can skip through to the 3rd slide, please, Ryan. So we're going to go through the functionality of using Zoom. If you are new to Zoom, if you are having trouble hearing, one of the things we want to draw your attention to is that typically the audio works better if you connect via your telephone instead of your computer audio. You can do that on your screen by accessing at the bottom where the panel is. You'll see on the left-hand side a phone that'll be where you connect via phone or your computer, and you can click connect via phone or audio. And if you need to connect via phone, it'll give you a dial-in. In addition, you're going to use the controls at the bottom to participate in the chat or the Q&A. We will be monitoring the chat and the question and answer throughout the webinar to answer any questions you may have. We will try to answer those live if they're pertaining to the entire group. If they are specific to your LEA, then we will just proceed with answering individually. Okay. Every participant is muted upon logging in, and that is to control for background noises. So the mission of the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Education and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. We do that through the Pennsylvania Department of Education's commitment to the least restrictive environment, whereby our goal for each child is to ensure individualized education program teams begin with a general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. We are going to go through 2 parts to today. The first part will cover the regulatory requirements with regard to secondary transition and provide a little bit of a background on where the transition requirements come from, as well as overview the state performance plan and the transition-related indicators. And then in addition, in the second part, we will be looking through the cyclical monitoring file review questions and giving you suggestions and time for reflection within your own practices. So we're going to start today with what the secondary transition regulatory requirements are for students with disabilities. This really begins with the Individuals with Disabilities Act, or IDEA 2004. When you look at the very definition or the purpose of IDEA 2004, we are to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free and appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So essentially, within the definition of IDEA 2004, we have an obligation to prepare students for the three areas that we write transition goals for: education, employment, and independent living. IDEA defines secondary transition as a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that is designed within a results-oriented process that is focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, including supported employment, continuing adult education, adult services, independent living, or community participation. What you can see here are the bolded things within the definition. So we want to make sure, again, that it's coordinated and results-oriented and that we're moving the child from school to post-school activities. With regard to transition, Chapter 14, the Pennsylvania Special Education Code, only differs from the federal regulations in one area: age. Specifically, in Pennsylvania, secondary transition must begin at age 14 or older if determined, or younger, if determined by the IEP team, which is different from the federal age of 16. And remember, it's the process of preparing students for life after they leave high school, including participation in post-secondary education or training, employment, and independent living in the community. So we talk about transition through Indicator 13, and we want to tell you a little bit about what Indicator 13 is. It is the percent of youth with IEPs age 16 or older with an IEP that includes age-appropriate measurable post-secondary goals that are annually updated and based upon an age-appropriate transition assessment, transition services, courses of study that will reasonably enable the student to meet those goals, and annual IEP goals that relate to the student's transition service needs. There also must be evidence that the student was invited to the IEP team meeting where transition services are to be discussed, and evidence that, if appropriate, a representative of any participating agency was invited to the IEP team meeting with prior consent of a parent or student who has reached the age of majority. Next, we're going to talk about where Indicator 13 falls within the state performance plan annual review. The SPPA-PR is required for each state under IDEA. All states are required to submit an SPPA-PR to the U.S. Department of Education through the Office of Special Education Programs. It is built around 17 federally required indicators of compliance and performance. Each state must set measurable and rigorous targets each year of the SPPA-PR and implement improvement strategies to reach these targets. Pennsylvania must report annually on their performance in meeting the targets and report publicly on the performance of all LEAs, which are school districts, charters, and other school systems on these targets. The indicators are set by OSEP, but each state sets its own target, except for Indicator 13, where the target is set at 100%. Stakeholders are actively involved in setting targets and determining whether these targets can be appropriate and continue to be appropriate. So here on this slide are the actual indicators. And as we talk about them, I want you to pay attention to, we're specifically talking about Indicator 13 transition goals for students aged 16 to 21, but there are several other indicators that actually have an influence on secondary transition or a relationship, including Indicator 1, graduation, and Indicator 2, dropout. In addition, we also consider Indicator 8, parent involvement, as very important within secondary transition, And then, of course, indicator 14, the post-school outcomes. So there are many indicators within the SPPA-PR that actually have influence in secondary transition. What you'll see on this slide is the connection between those various indicators specifically related to secondary transition. What you'll want to do is start from the bottom and work your way up. In general, however, these indicators should be looked at together when you're thinking about overall transition program success and areas of need. So at the foundation, you are starting with high quality, rigorous, standards aligned secondary school programming for all students. Indicator 13 then is what looks at, are we designing high quality IEPs which will help students achieve their post-secondary goals? Indicators 1, 2, and 17 actually influence that students are actively engaged, stay in school, and graduate. And indicator 14 is how we measure, are students achieving those goals that they set for themselves? With our idea being that regardless of background, condition, or circumstance, all students in Pennsylvania graduate proficient in core subject, graduate high school ready for post-secondary education and career, and they're achieving high outcomes. So many of you may be thinking, we've had indicator 13 training before, or some variant of it in the past, and what I want to show you on this slide is the statewide data that has been reported to OSEP with regard to indicator 13 compliance. Remember, the target is 100%. Now, some of you may see this data and wonder what is affecting the variance across the years. Remember that this data coincides with and is collected with the cohort of LEAs that go through cyclical monitoring within a given year. Therefore, cohorts are reported once every 6 years. So theoretically, the group that was surveyed in 2009 would be the same group as 2015. So you might think, oh, look, there's growth of 6.97%. However, due to changes in the monitoring schedule, different cohorts were assessed in those time periods. And again, different cohorts between each of the 6 years. That being said, no matter which way you look at it, the reality is that Pennsylvania is not obtaining the 100% compliance target, and therefore we must continue our efforts to educate LEAs on the requirements under indicator 13. So you might be thinking, we're going through cyclical monitoring for continuous improvement. What are the file review questions that are related to secondary transition, and what does that process look like? Next slide. Perfect. So in your cyclical monitoring, you will be required to submit 10 files selected with the exceptions of Philadelphia and the School District of Pittsburgh. That will include the IEP, the ER, RRs, invitations, etc. 3 of those 10 files must be students aged 16 to 21. At least one student must be aged 14 to 15, and 1 student who is receiving services in an approved private school. On the cyclical monitoring, there are 340 education questions, which are all related to different areas of compliance in special education. But there are file reviews that are also completed directly related to transition, which were added in 2015. So you'll also then be required to submit an additional 10 files of students aged 14 and older and answer 10 additional questions related to transition. So from a transition lens, what are those file review questions? They're listed here on the slide. If you look at question 245, it specifically relates to transition planning and services, so evidence that the parent was invited to discuss the transition services and planning for their student. Question 246 and 270 specifically look at agency invitation and agency participation in the IEP team meeting. Question 247 of the file review is specific to evidence that the student was invited to their transition planning process in the IEP. And 264 is documentation of the student's participation in their IEP. 268 and 269 are the documentation of CTE participation when a student is attending a CTE. Question 288 is there evidence that you have documented the CTE's program CIP code if they're in a CTE program? Question 289 links to age-appropriate transition assessment, and we're going to spend some time talking about transition assessment. Question 290 goes specifically through evidence of post-secondary goal statements for education and training, employment, and independent living. 291 are those post-secondary goals evidence to be updated annually. Question 292 is the transition grid completed completely and correctly? Question 292A is, are there courses of studies documented? 292B, are there services and activities listed in the transition grid for all three areas? And 292C, is there a measurable annual goal linked or listed in the grid? So we're going to spend some time throughout the remainder of today's presentation talking about what that looks like in the IEP. Transition planning can be thought of as an ongoing process as reflected by the visual on this slide. So at the beginning, we start with assessment. We use the assessment to do a summary within the present levels of academic and functional performance specific to transition. We invite and involve the right stakeholders to the table for the IEP planning. We use the information from the assessment and from our agency and other partners in the transition planning process to develop an appropriate transition plan. And from there, we want to create our measurable annual goals that align to making sure that we are moving students through their areas of need to help give them access to their transition plan. And from there, we then begin monitoring progress to make sure that the students are meeting their goals and that we are implementing the transition plan. And it all starts again every year with assessment. And that really is the process that we want to think of. So in step one, we talked specifically about transition assessment. Transition assessment is needed to identify the student's post-secondary desired goals or vision. And so we're thinking along the lines of what different types of information do we need to gather to get that information. When we look at the Indicator 13 checklist and the cyclical monitoring file review questions on the next slide, you'll see that the Indicator 13 checklist that we provided you with as a handout, and as a reminder for those that maybe joined us a little bit late, the handouts for today's training are on the patent training calendar on today's event under resources for today's webinar or event files. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be stored on the patent website so that you can access it at a later date and time. It takes a few days for us to get through the closed captioning and get it listed on the website. So I'm sorry, can you go back one slide for a second? So what you'll see on the left are the file review questions in red. So specific to assessment, evidence that the measurable post-secondary goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessment. And is there evidence on the Indicator 13 checklist when you're looking at IEPs within your LEA that you have age-appropriate transition assessment? Next slide, please. So when we think about assessment, what are we really needing to capture? The three areas that we want to be capturing to get information about students are those things that gather information about the student's interests, preferences, skills, and aptitudes. We're also needing information about academic achievement, and we also need information about functional performance because each one of those things in and of themselves don't tell us the whole picture about the child. And when we're doing transition planning, it really is important to think about how does the student's strengths and needs influence their ability to be successful in their post-secondary goal attainment. And also, how do their functional performance needs and strengths influence that beyond just the interests, preference, skills, and aptitudes. What we see when we look at Indicator 13 file reviews for students is that we've gotten good at giving assessment, but we're not great yet at interpreting the assessment or giving varied types of assessments. So we want to make sure that we're giving varied types of assessments that look at multiple domains. So what is the purpose of transition assessment? Transition assessment helps you to answer questions like, who is the student? What are the student's unique talents and interests? What does that student want now and in life in the future? What are some of life's demands that the student can meet now? And what are the main barriers for the student in terms of them getting what they need and want from their school and community? What are the students' options in school and the community, and what are they preparing them for in terms of what they want now and in the future? And ultimately, we're using that information to formulate appropriate post-secondary goals and develop the plan to help reach those goals. Proper assessment basically informs us where the student currently is. Think about the present levels of academic and functional performance and where the student wants to go. So think college and career, post-secondary goals. That transition plan is what lays out what is going to happen to help that student get to his or her post-secondary goal. It's that bridge or that connector between where they are and where they want to be. So as you sit here through today's webinar, I want you to think about how students are currently being assessed within your LEA. What things are you using to capture interests, preference, skills, abilities, and aptitudes? And is that reflected in the IEP that you're holding? Do you have sufficient evidence of assessment of academic achievement and documentation? And have you considered how their academic achievement might influence their post-secondary goal attainment? And same thing for functional performance. So let's talk a little bit specifically about what types of assessments we can use to capture interest, preference, skills, and aptitudes. So there are many different types of assessment. There are things you can gather from the students, from the parents and other team members, and also from students if they're on job sites. So from the student lens, you can collect and conduct formal assessments, interviews, surveys, web-based assessments, questionnaires, direct observations, and different transition checklists, whether locally developed or available widespread. In addition, you want to be sure that you're capturing information from parents, family caregivers, and other team members. So you could also be looking at things that they can fill out, including surveys, interviews, and rating scales, person-centered planning tools, a functional behavior assessment if appropriate, and then formal planning tools, so formal structured interviews and rating scales that you can be given. In addition, information can be collected from students who are on job sites, such as situational assessments, so how do they perform in specific job-related situations. Ecological assessment, so in that instance you're looking at how does the student perform globally across the task, and it's an observation that you conduct at a job site. In addition, employer observations and surveys and input forms that they could be putting in. Feedback from job shadowing and feedback from volunteering opportunities all can contribute to good assessment within transition. Here are some of the many different types of ways that you can use surveys to gather interest, preferences, skills, and aptitudes. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just essentially a list that's available to you. And we'll highlight specifically PA Career Zone. For example, they have a quick assessment, the interest profiler, and the work importance profiler. So these are all different ways that you can capture some data for students, but by no means is exhaustive. And I will highlight that we will be doing a series with OVR, Office of Developmental Programs, and OMSAS that will highlight transition assessment through the different agency lenses. Look for that on our on our patent training calendar. So we will dig more deeply into different types of assessment on that as well if you're interested in more. Some additional surveys that you could be using are the ARC Self-Determination Scale, the Differential Aptitude Scale, the Transition Planning Inventory, Career and Tech Ed assessments, commercially prepared assessments for specific career-related aptitudes, an environmental job assessment, and the Brigance transition skills. Again, this is by no means exhaustive of all of the different assessments, but just giving you some examples of assessments that you can use. And as a reminder, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature and or the chat feature in at the bottom of your tool screen as we showed at the beginning. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about assessing academic achievement as well. And remember, within assessing academic achievement, we're going to look specifically at 4 different types of assessment. Summative being those types of assessment that progress at the end of a period of instruction to determine what was learned. Formative assessment, which is informal and formal assessments that are used to determine the direction of instruction. So an example, review, reteach, extend, and go on. Diagnostic assessments are those that are used to determine areas of strength and weakness with regard to specific skills. And also benchmark assessments, which are designed to provide feedback to both the teacher and student about how the student is progressing towards demonstrating proficiency on grade level standards. Well-designed benchmark assessments and standards-based assessments measure that degree to which a student has mastered a given concept, measures concept skills and or applications, and is reported by referencing standards. So good transition planning begins with assessment of varied nature. So the best type of assessment summary would include all of those areas. So we know that there are 3 general academic areas that students may have difficulty with: reading, writing, and math. And so there may be other disabilities that we're assessing, but in terms of academic, we're looking at, do we have baseline data based on those 3 academic kind of skill areas that a student would be struggling with? And how do we assess that, document it in the IEP to tell where they currently are functioning and where they need to grow, and how does that develop into a measurable annual goal after we provide instruction? So we talked again about math, reading, and written expression as the 3 areas, and that may influence science and social studies. But there are listed here some different ways that you can interpret, or assessments that you can use to interpret to give information about where a student is currently functioning. So things like the PSSA or the Keystone assessments, classroom-based formative assessments, diagnostic assessments, curriculum-based assessment, CDT data, assessment data that is completed in the ER or RR for the student, and input from the teacher. At the crux of this is that we need to interpret that data. So we want to review general and specific needs as a result of the assessment findings. So what is the gap that the student has with regard to the standards? So where is the student in comparison to where they're expected to be given their grade level? And we're looking at also monitoring and summarizing where that student has been on that goal in the past. So what was the goal in the past, including a statement of the progress that they've made towards that goal, and whether that goal needs to continue as is and why, or it needs to be adjusted, or if it's mastered and there's no need for a goal. Then we also need to consider, if there's no deficit in an area, you still want to include some data to document that there's no deficit in a specific area. We don't want to also forget the impact that students who are using assistive technology have in regard to those 3 areas. If they're using any accessible instructional materials, again, you can access those on the patent site. And any SDI that's working or isn't working, and why for a particular student. So if we're looking at the SDI annually through the IEP process, we're documenting what is working and what may no longer be needed for that particular student. What we see typically by the time a student is transition age is that a student might have SDI that is a mile long, but when you're sitting in the IEP with a student, they haven't used any of it within the last 5 years. So we want to make sure that we're reviewing that SDI and having a conversation about what is being used. The final area that we're assessing is functional performance, and let's talk a little bit more specifically about what that encapsulates. So through functional performance, we're looking specifically at things related to behavior, OT, PT, and other related service activities, activities of daily living, social skills, the development of the student's self-advocacy, and skills that they may need as a consumer or to live in the community. Again, we're collecting that baseline data and reporting that in the present levels. We're talking about where they are and where they need to go to create that measurable annual goal, and we're monitoring that with progress. If a student has a functional behavior assessment, you want to include that as well. And another area to consider is some of the executive functioning skills and how do they relate to the student's current level of functioning and where they want to go in the future. So how do they do with organization, time management, planning, thinking about thinking, regulation, emotion regulation, social awareness, and sustained attention, because all of those things will have a direct implication on how a child might function in the future. I use this example a lot. For independent living, typically we think of independent living goals as needed specifically or solely for those students with more significant disabilities, and that in fact isn't true. An example might be a student who has ADHD. They're going to need to be able to plan out, and if they're receiving medication, when do they need to call to refill their prescription in order to get their next medication to stay on track. They also have issues with organization, so if their goal is to go to college, how are they going to organize and time manage taking 4 different classes in a university with a study or with a course syllabus that tells you when things are due but not with benchmarks. So those things are part of daily living skills that might need to be addressed for students. And so we need to expand our thinking about independent living beyond just students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. Next slide. Again, to summarize, we're looking at activities of daily living, consumer skills, OT and PT assessment, speech assessment. We're looking at personal safety. We're also looking at accessing public transportation and or transporting themselves in other ways, recreation, and community involvement, all things that influence independent living. And that must be data-driven. So I mentioned that we've gotten really good at putting assessments into IEPs currently, but where we're seeing some struggle is interpreting data and making sense of it. And I want you to think about what these symbols mean to you right now with just seeing them. If you just saw those symbols, you don't know what they mean. You know they may take you somewhere or have meaning, but without a QR code reader, you're not going to know what that QR code means. And without a barcode scanner, you're not going to know what that means. So that information needs to be translated into something for you. The same can be true about assessment data. Having a STAY-9 score of X on any particular assessment is not particularly useful information if you don't translate that information into something meaningful. Even a PSAT or an SAT score alone isn't meaningful unless there's context behind it. So let's talk a little bit about how can we interpret data and make sense of it. So the process of interpreting data really means that you should be thinking about what it is that you want to know about that particular student and answering what are their strengths, what are their needs, what are their interests and preferences. In addition, that part of the IEP should also be talking about what similarities are there between the different ratings, what differences might exist and why, and what patterns do you find by looking at the data. And then the biggest part of that is considering how that data that you've collected relates to the student's long-term goals. No matter how assessment data is obtained through any of those means above, we must make sure that we're interpreting the data in the present level section of the IEP. That helps to formulate our baseline data. Some things that you should be considering: does the student possess the skills needed to pursue the coursework that you're outlining for them? Any co-curricular opportunities and extracurricular opportunities that match their interests and preferences? Are there any career-related experiences or activities or instruction that's needed to help the student acquire the skills? Does the goal need to be modified? The process of collecting and analyzing data continues over the course of the transition planning years until desirable, realistic visions for post-school lives are in harmony with the student's interests, preferences, and strengths. Having the student's vision for lives can change with time and experience, and IEP teams can strategically use assessment data to identify needs to be addressed to help create that coordinated set of activities for transition as a student moves towards their goals. If we don't identify needs in the present level section, we can't drive the remaining components of the IEP, including designing appropriate transition services, courses of study, transition activities, annual goals-related services, and supplementary aids and services. So we've gone through step 1, assessment. Now we want to talk a little bit about step 2, which is writing the summary information in the present levels of academic and functional performance. So how do we actually incorporate the assessment data? Really what you want to think about is this process as a funnel. So at the top of the funnel, we're talking about their academic skills, we're talking about functional skills, and we're looking at skills related to post-secondary transition information, parent input, teacher input, student input, and we're thinking through that funnel of how does the disability impact involvement in the general education curriculum. And from there, we're able to develop what are our needs and strengths. And that really is the process that we want to think about, as well as some of what we talked about in the assessment section with interpreting data to drive the writing of the present levels. So let's take a moment to use the tool that you were provided with, so the File Review Prep Guide. Take a moment, we're going to pause, and you can look quickly at the IEP that you have with you to look for evidence that measurable post-secondary goals were based on age-appropriate transition assessments. So you're looking specifically in your IEP for, is there evidence in the IEP that assessment data was used to determine the goals? And you're marking it simply yes or no. And then you want to kind of reflect into practice. Do all of your teachers typically write post-secondary goals based on age-appropriate transition assessments? So if yes, you're in good shape. If no, you might want to think about what could you do either prior to your monitoring or after, if you've already gone through your monitoring, to think about what you can do to ensure that teachers utilize age-appropriate assessment when writing post-secondary goals. So just take a moment, and then my colleague Ryan is going to pick up with the next set of slides.
Thanks, Hillary. Take about 2 minutes to look in through your IEP, and then we'll jump on to the next section. Okay, hopefully everybody had enough time to review. As Hillary mentioned before, this is going to be recorded. It'll take a couple weeks usually until we get the closed captioning and everything up there, but if you do need to review it and run maybe one of your IEPs through to do a cross-check to see how you're doing with that, you know, you could always upload that, and also you could always walk through with the materials that we gave you there to do a self-audit of your IEP. So I'm going to get moving on here. My name's Ryan Romanowski from the Patton Harrisburg office. So good morning to everyone. We're going to jump into the student invitation and invite and involve. We're going to get into agencies and things like that. So that's what we'll be covering here in the next couple sections. Hillary hit on the assessment piece, which is, and she said it there at the end multiple times, the assessment and the present levels is where it is very important to get all that good stuff in there, because that drives the rest of the IEP. Without good present levels, you're probably not going to have a very good IEP moving forward, especially with the transition plan. Okay, so step 3 of the process is the student invitation, parental consent, and agency involvement. We want to invite and involve. So we're talking about here every student that is, you know, 14 or is going to be 14 in their annual IEP year. They need to be invited to the IEP meeting. And we're going to go through that here through the invitation and everything like that. So here are just the file review questions in the monitoring document. So when you do have your special education audit, these are the file review questions that will cover that. So file review question 246 is transition planning and services. If appropriate, evidence that a representative of any participating agency was invited to the IEP team meeting with the prior consent of the parent or student. If agency is not providing the services or paying for the services, you would indicate NA. Now, we will get into the agencies here after we go through the invitation. We're going to really hit on what boxes you need to check on the invitation, because that could be a kind of a gray area with folks. and sometimes that's where you know, there are some easy things that are marked off during your monitoring because the appropriate boxes were not checked on the invitation. But we are going to get into agency involvement here shortly. And then indicator 13, on your indicator 13 checklist, which is the one that we just reviewed before turning over to me, if appropriate, is there evidence that a representative of any participant agency was invited to the IEP team meeting with prior consent of the parent or student, age of majority reached? And then here's just some more file review questions that go along with it. You know, when you go through the transition, or when you go through your special education audit, question 247, you're going to be talking about transition planning is checked. We're going to get into that, make sure we're checking the appropriate boxes. And then transition planning and services, question number 245, invitation to parents is checked for students that are 14 or older. And what that means is younger is if they're 13 and going to be turning 14 in that annual IEP year. And then the indicator 13 checklist question number 1 is there evidence that the student was invited to the IEP team meeting? Okay, so the invitation must reflect that both the parents and the students are invited for the for the IEP meeting, especially if the student is of transition age. So back in May of 2015, there was a revision that was done to this invitation document, and it made things a lot easier. So they removed the requirement to use 2 separate invitations to participate in the IEP team meeting for transition and planning services. So beginning in June of 2015, LEAs needed to begin using this format. Now, I'm sure all of you are now using this. Whatever IEP writing system you may have probably only spits out one of these documents. Now, I know in the past, it all determined what you're using, but you would have to get an IEP signed by both the parent and, or make sure you had the IEP signed by both the parent and the student, and that's not the case. We took care of that here. BSC took care of that by revising this document and just using one document now. Okay, so how do I know and whom to invite for a transition IEP? So we get a lot of questions about agency involvement, who needs to be invited, when to invite them, things like that. So you want to invite an agency if it's likely to provide or pay for transition services, and you can only invite an agency with parent permission. So that's very important. Agencies can only be invited with parent permission. Now you want to get that information out to them during the IEP meeting, what agencies are available, what is out there, but you want to provide that information, and we want to have that documented somewhere in the IEP present levels. Most notably, we like to have it somewhere in the transition section of the present levels, so that, you know, if agencies were invited or not, if not, that the information was provided to the parents, and that needs to be documented somewhere in the present levels. And it could be just a little blurb when you're in there, but it doesn't have to be anything, you know, monstrous or overwhelming, but it does need to be addressed, and that seems to be an area too that gets marked off in our special education audits, that just because agencies weren't involved, you know, folks were not putting anything in there in the present levels. You still have to provide that information. That information about agencies was provided to the IEP team parents. Yes.
Hi, we have a question that I think would benefit everybody. So the question is, what is the age of consent for students to invite an agency? So although a student, even though a child reaches the age of majority by 18, under IDEA, parents continue to have educational rights until age 21. So unfortunately, the answer is 21. So if a student is still in school at 18, the parent still has the educational rights and can decide whether or not they want to invite an agency to the IEP team meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. Okay, and then agency involvement is based on individual needs. Obviously, younger students' involvement with outside agencies might be limited, and agency involvement may vary by region. You know, depending where you are in the state, you may have more resources than others. So they will vary by region. So document agency involvement in the present levels, like I mentioned. and putting agency involvement as a separate bullet in this section is helpful. And what we mean by separate bullet is if you were to look at the annotated version of the IEP on the patent website, when you go through it, it shows and recommends that each section of the present levels is bulleted to really clean it up and make things easier to find. So what we mean by bullet is each section, so your academic performance would be bulleted, boom, functional performance bulleted, all information underneath, transition section bulleted underneath. And it just really cleans things up and helps both the caseload manager or anybody looking at the IEP, especially your BSE advisor, because it makes things a lot easier to find. Okay.
I also want to highlight, and thank you to one of our IU TAC for pointing this out, that it is important to know that even when agencies cannot attend, for example, OVR, they do still need to be invited. They are not required IEP team participants, but they are required to be invited if they are thought to be likely to provide or pay for services. So although they may not be able to attend, you still want to invite them. We are still working through explaining to OVR that we are required to invite them even if they can't attend. And like Ryan said, it's really important that we, when they don't attend, document that we're providing information to families and students about the services that they could be providing. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so on this slide, here is an example of the invitation. I'm sure you're all aware of this. This is very familiar to you. So you'll see here that there are boxes available to state the purpose of the IEP meeting. And you can check as many boxes that apply, but if the student is 14 years or older, or the student is turning 14 with the duration IEP, you want to check the box that states transition planning will be discussed. So that would be where the first arrow is there. You'll also want to check the box below it, and then finally you will need to include the student's name listed under IEP team members invited to the meeting. So as you can see, that second arrow underneath at the bottom of the page there, you want to make sure you're writing in the appropriate person that will be attending. All right. So again, there's now just one invitation letter to invite both the parents and the student to the meeting. However, the boxes that we just went over will need to be checked in order to be compliant. So this is an area, like I mentioned earlier, where a lot of times, you know, the BSE advisors go out and they're doing the file review, and the appropriate boxes are not checked. So we want to really hammer on making sure that you're very aware of when you're filling out the invitation to address these boxes and make sure you're checking the appropriate boxes, because that can be an easy check off when you're going through your special education audit. All right, so best practice and evidence. Does the IEP or present levels include information regarding agency involvement? And just some notes here. Representatives from agencies were invited with parent permission, and it was documented in the IEP, or parents refused consent to inviting outside agency personnel, and it was documented in the IEP. So the big thing here is documentation. So we always say document, document, document. Very important to get things in there and explain yourself to really back up all the decisions that you're making there. If you're not documenting, then it's almost like you're pulling things out of the air. Always have documentation in there. And we want to make sure that parents are provided with the information about agency involvement, and it was documented in IEP. As we said again, document, document, document. And then we just want to ensure, as we mentioned before, we keep hammering on this, and we do it over and over, because this is an area where a lot of wrongs or I shouldn't say wrongs, but no's have been checked on the special education audit, is checking those appropriate boxes. So just make sure that we are checking those appropriate boxes. Can't say it enough. And then here's just an example of where you would bullet it. As we mentioned earlier, we want to bullet that in the present level. So here's just a quick example of agency involvement. See how the bullets are for post-secondary education and training. You have the employment goal bulleted, independent living goal bulleted, and then underneath agency involvement, and then just have that information provided there. It really cleans things up and makes things look nice and easy to find. All right, so documentation on IEP team participation. and participation by an agency representative. So attendance may include participation via telephone or video conference. The IEP team may list the names of the individuals who participate via phone or video conference in the printed name column and note how they participated. So just like, you know, you really want to make sure that you're exhausting every avenue to get folks to the table, or whether it be video conference, as we mentioned here before, or any way possible, really prove the impossible that you can't get them there before making sure that they're not attending the meeting, especially parents. When we're trying to get them to the IEP team meetings, you know, really exhaust every avenue to get them there, whether it be changing the time of day or, you know, video conference. I always give an example. I do special education audits in prisons. So there was actually a student that was locked up with his father at the same time, and they attended the IEP meeting together. But so really just do what you need to do to get them to the table. And if you can't get the parents to the table, you really need to document that you made reasonable attempts. And what we mean by reasonable attempts is we go by the 3-strike rule. You know, make 3 reasonable attempts, whether that be via phone, email, a letter in the mail, any way possible to get them involved. And then if you're not getting any response, then really just keep that documentation, and that backs you up that you made your attempt to get those folks to the table. Okay, and then we want to make sure with the agency that you can also get written input from the agency team members should they be included in the present education levels under secondary transition. Here's some sample IEP statements just for agencies. Representatives from agencies were invited with parent permission. Parent refused to consent to inviting outside agency personnel, or although the agency did not participate in IEP team meeting, parents and students were provided with information upcoming about the upcoming agency involvement. So there's just some examples that you can pull from that you should be seeing in IEP present levels. And real quick, just a quick example of what an agency statement may look like in an IEP. Bob and his family were provided with information regarding the supports provided through the Allegheny River Intellectual Disability Services and the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. Bob met with supports coordinator from ARID on May 3rd, 2017, and now has a current open case. Bob is scheduled for an intake with an OVR representative during the fall of 2017. Both OVR and ARID representatives were invited to his current IEP meeting. So there's just a quick example of using a hypothetical situation. Bob is the student, and what you may see when you're looking through the present levels and providing an agency statement. And then here's just some examples of agencies. We have the Office of, obviously, OVR, the County Mental Health, the ARC. I'm not going to read all of them. That's just a list there. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but just examples of agencies that may be invited to an IEP meeting. IEP team participants for transition planning. So by law, you know, there's the parents and guardians, the LEA representative, one general ed teacher, one special ed teacher are all mandatory to be at the IEP team meeting. So after that, it is up to the IEP team, most notably also the parents, who else they would like to be involved in the IEP team meeting. So here's just some other members on the right that may be involved in the IEP team meeting. But we want to make sure that we're getting those legal the participants that need to be there, that are mandated to be there. So one parent or guardian, one LEA rep, one general ed teacher, one special education teacher. And as I mentioned, getting the parents involved, really, that's a big one because, you know, I've looked at IEPs, many IEPs where the parents were just weren't at the IEP meeting and there was no documentation whatsoever there. So really, if you're having trouble getting parents to the table, just make sure you're exhausting every way to contact them. We say the 3 reasonable attempts, and if you're not getting it documented, that they are just not responding. And you're good. All right, so let's take a moment here. We'll take about 2 minutes here. And this is on your handout, the what LEAs need to know file review prep guide. We're looking at regulation 245. So transition planning and services, invitation to parent is checked. This actually will only take 30 seconds. So if you have an invitation available, just make sure that the invitation to the parent's checked and that the student is also invited. And as we're waiting here, I'm going to answer a question here. So Tina here, where is the best place to document attempts to get parents to the meeting? You know, you could put that in a present level somewhere. If there really is no, you know, exact place to put it, you know, I always like to put, well, not me, but I've always seen a lot of people even write it on the participant page where you're going to write the names of who participated in the IEP team. They've even just wrote it in pen or pencil somewhere that they made the document and attempts, put the date and time. The more specific you could be, the better. We've also had folks type up something, you know, have a little document that had, hey, it had the parent's name on top. This is the time and date that I contacted him, the way I tried to contact him, whether it be email, phone call, however, and then, you know, on a separate piece of paper and just attached to the IEP. But there's no one way that you need to do it. You could pretty much do it however you'd like. Just make sure it's somewhere in the IEP, preferably somewhere where your BSC advisor can see it, because if they get into the, if they come into the members page who attended the IEP meeting and they're not seeing the parent there, that's going to be a red flag right away. So you're going to want to have something there to lead them to the documentation to back you up why they weren't there. And just real quick, think about your LEA as a whole systemically. What system is in place to ensure that students 14 years and older are invited to the IEP? And how do you engage a student in his or her IEP meeting? So think about those things briefly here for about 30 seconds, and then we'll move on. Do you guys have something in place as an LEA that guarantees that you're not going to miss these students who are 14 years or older of transition age to be invited to the IEP meeting? Also, big thing here is a lot of times I've heard, you know, a student is 13 years old but is going to be 14. So the student's 13 years old and it's September of this year. The student is going to be 14 years old in January of this year. You should be starting transition services with that student because they will be turning 14 in that school year. Okay. And just some more Let's Reflect questions. This is in your handout, the file review prep guide. Very good to cross-reference your IEPs with to really do a self-assessment of your IEPs. All right, so section 3, well, step 4 of this process, but it's section 3 of the IEP is a transition grid. And this is usually, when you talk transition, this is the piece that everybody's most familiar with, the grid. So we're going to go through each part of the grid, the goals, the courses of study, the services and activity here in the next few slides. So when we're talking the Indicator 13 checklist, here's the file and the CMCI review questions. So in your special education monitoring, the question and the file review is if the student's IEP required participation in a career and technical education program or CTE program, was the SIP code completed? So if you're in the present levels of the IEP, there is a section for students who are in the VOTEC or Career and Technical Ed. They should have a CIP code, CIP code, and that should be located and provided in this section. It's in the transition services piece after the post-school goals, actually right before you get to the grid. It should be listed there. Okay, so that is a file review question. And if a kid is in the Career and Tech Ed, the BSC advisor will be looking to see if they have a CIP code available there. And then there's just a file review question that goes along with the CIP code. So check out your IEP if you have a student that is in the VOTEC and see if that code is there. If not, you might want to look it up and get it in there. And then here's just some more file review questions and then the checklist, how they go across. So are appropriate measurable post-secondary goal or goals that cover education, training, employment, and independent living as needed? And then is there evidence that the post-secondary goals that covers education, training, employment, and independent living as needed updated annually? So we're going to go through that here next, but we want to make sure that each area is addressed in the present levels and in the grid. So when we're talking transition-wise, we want to make sure that post-secondary education, employment, and independent living, all of them are addressed. Can't hammer that enough. In the present levels, a lot of times, I know in the past, it's been greatly corrected over the years, but when we go into the present levels, you would see, one or two of these may be missing. Most particularly the independent living piece, you would see no information there. And we'll go through that, when you need an independent living goal, when you do not need an independent living goal, and how you would address that. All right, so when we're talking about best practice, we want to make sure present education levels provide evidence that all three post-secondary education goal areas have been considered. As I just mentioned, we want to hit on post-secondary education, training, employment, and independent living. Is there a post-secondary goal for education, training, or a statement that the area was addressed by the IEP team? Is there a post-secondary goal for employment or a statement that the area was addressed by the IEP team? And then same with the independent living. Is there a post-secondary goal for independent living or a statement that the area was addressed by the IEP team? So we don't want to leave any of these areas blank. There's no NAs in there. I know in the past I've seen NAs in sections. Well, this kid doesn't have what it takes to work a job after high school or this or that. So they just won't address it at all. I think we've really rectified that over the years since going through this Indicator 13 training and going through a few cycles of it. It's really, really improved upon that, because in the past we were seeing a lot of NAs, a lot of present levels in the secondary transition piece that were blank or very thin, so to say. And then just to add on to that, will the goals occur after the student graduates from school? We'll get in how to do that in your statement. Is there evidence that the post-secondary goals are updated annually, and a summary of previous goals is referenced? So, and we do this by, there's a notation made that based on updated assessments, goals remain the same. So when we're in the present levels, it's important that you go back each year for the annual IEP review when you're reviewing that student's goals, and really take a really deep look into the present levels to see has the student's goals changed, and that's why it's important to do assessments annually, sometimes most notably new assessments annually, or update assessments to see if the students post-secondary education goals or preferences are still the same, if they changed. A student over the summer, or let's just say at the end of the year last year, may have wanted to be a vet or something like that. Over the summer, he worked in a doggy daycare, and by the end of the summer, he just couldn't stand animals. So when he comes back the next school year, it's important to talk with the kid or update his assessment to see where he or she is, because if he hates animals, then after that summer of working with animals, having that environmental experience with them, then he probably is going to want to change his interests and preferences moving forward. So just keep note of that. And there's many examples that you could go with that. So, and then you also want to notate that a goal has changed from year to year, from one year to the next and why. All right, so what do I put in the grid? So it's measurable post-secondary goals for education, career, and independent living, courses of study, services related to the measurable annual goals and activities, which we're going to explain these here in the oncoming slide. So measurable post-secondary goals. So we want to review the assessment data that was created. So all the stuff that Hillary was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, all of that transition assessment, whether it be student interviews, interest inventories, we gave a list early on, those online assessment pieces like PA Career Zone, things like that, taking all that information, getting it into the present levels, and now this is what drives the grid and what creates the grid to make those statements that we're going to be entering into the grid measurable. So we want to look at the post-secondary education piece of it and what assessments were used there to gain information on the students' interests and preferences there. What do they want to be doing post high school or post graduation, and then obviously the other pieces as well. What assessment and information was interpreted there for the post-secondary education employment, and then the post-secondary independent living goal. And the measurable goals are based on the transition assessment, as we mentioned here, knowledge of the post-secondary options, and the input of the entire educational planning team, including the student in their training and education, employment, and independent living. So it's very important to write meaningful post-secondary goals. Common misconception here is that post-secondary goals are your measurable annual goals. I've seen IEPs in the past where I've gone in, took a look at the grid, and they had the measurable annual goal written in for the post-secondary education goal, the employment goal, and the independent living goal. That is not where we're putting the measurable annual goals. There's a whole other section in the IEP. Later on in the IEP is where you're going to put your measurable annual goals. So post-secondary education goals are what is to happen or what may happen following graduation. So that's how we need to write them, and we're going to show you how to do that here shortly. But it is not the measurable annual goal. The measurable annual goal is increasing deficits. So if a student has a deficit in math or reading or writing, those are the things we're doing to help increase those deficits. So the measurable annual goals go into helping is what we're doing now currently in school to help the student reach his post-secondary education goals once he graduates. So they are not measurable annual goals. Okay, and then here's just a sample grid. This is for the obviously section 3 of the IEP. If you look here, you can see where the arrow is. This is where you would put your post-secondary education goal would be written in there. And as we mentioned before, just nailing on it again, we want to use the transition assessment to develop post-secondary goals, realistic post-secondary goals. And, you know, we may cover this a little bit later, but when we talk realistic goals, we talk, are these achievable? So for example, we get a lot of students that want to be NFL football players or basketball players or things like that. So our goal is not to be a goal crusher or, you know, just bring the world down on the student and say, no, that's just not going to happen. That's fine if they want to be an NFL player and things like that. However, there are ways to bring out other information in that field. So there are other jobs in that field of sports that they may want to do. So, you know, leave that open, but hey, you want to be an NFL player, there are other options here. Let's just stick into that sports world. Maybe here are some other options that are more realistic maybe being a sports trainer, or you know, working in a sports store like Dick's Sporting Goods or something like that. So don't be a goal killer, you know, and crush the student right off the bat, but we need to make realistic goals. So another example would be, you know, a student who has a first grade reading level wants to be a brain surgeon, okay? You know, obviously this is probably not something that's realistic based on assessment, and that's why it's important to have all this great academic, functional performance and transition assessment in there, because it gives you some legs when you make your decisions and present this at the IEP team meeting. It gives you some backup, so to say, when you're deciding and writing these goals. So the kid that wants to be a brain surgeon with a first grading level, okay, we could do that and still think about that, but let's go somewhere else in the medical field, maybe, you know, of a job that's more realistic. So realistic goals are important. And real quickly, we'll just reflect, take a look at your IEP for the file review prep guide. So an appropriate measurable post-secondary goal or goal that covers education or training or employment, and as needed independent living are in there. And then regulation 291, evidence that the post-secondary goal or goal that covers education, training, employment, and independent living are located in the grid. And the big thing is, like I said before, we don't want to leave anything blank. There should be a statement in the grid, no matter what. Specifically, when we talk about independent living, this is really the only area of post-secondary goal that could be a yes or no when we're talking, does the student need an independent living goal or not? You may go through and the student may be functioning great and may not need an independent living goal. However, a lot of times people think just because a student doesn't need an independent living goal that they don't need to address it at all. And that's not the case. Whether the student needs an independent living goal or not, you still need to address it in the present levels with assessment to determine that the student does not need an independent living goal. And you also need to put a statement in the present levels, or not in the present levels, on the grid, I'm sorry, that addresses that as well. So really, we want to keep away from the blanks and the NAs. Everything has to be addressed in the present levels and backed up by assessment, no matter if it's yes or no. Okay, so now we're going to move on to courses of study. This section's pretty quick when we're talking when you're going through your special education monitoring. Really, is it there or isn't it? And being specific about the courses that the student is taking at the time. So this is the file review question that is addressed in the file review. So transition services include courses of study that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals. And what are courses of study? They're part of a coordinated set of activities that helps the student move from high school to identify post-secondary goals. They support academic and functional achievement, should promote graduation. They should be aligned with the post-secondary goals. Courses of study should be listed by course name. And I think this is the most important thing, especially when we're getting into compliance. The check mark that is second from the bottom. Courses should be listed by course name using the LEA's program of studies, not functional curriculum or college prep. So, for example, when a BSc advisor goes in, they don't want to see, and they're looking through IEPs, they're going to look at courses of study on the grid, and they're not going to want to see math, reading, just the term math, reading, social studies there. They want it to be more specific. So they want it to be Algebra 1, or British literature. Whatever that student is taking, the more specific you can be, the better, because it shows that the student is taking classes that are progressing him or her into reaching their post-secondary education goals, and that courses are changing from year to year, and they're just not stuck taking the same courses over and over and over again. Now, some places I know, like when you get into middle school, it may just be Math 6 or Math 7, something like that, and that's okay, but just be specific as possible when listing your courses of study, because if you're going in and just seeing that it's math, reading, social studies, and just very, bland explanation of what those courses are, that's going to raise a red flag. So be specific. And this is where they would be listed on the transition grid, right underneath the statement, the post-secondary education goal statement. Pretty simple, but surprisingly does get checked off often because it's either not addressed or not addressed as specifically as possible. And here's just an example of what that may look like. Okay, so instead of saying science, they say biology. Instead of saying English, English 3, okay? And then real quickly, just reflect, what are your courses of study looking like in the example IEP that you have? Oh, okay, so we have a question. Do you need to include anticipated courses for the next school year? This is always a question because folks, obviously don't like to do the revisions because they're afraid, hey, if I put the anticipated courses, what happens if they don't take those anticipated courses? This has been up and down, and Hillary, I don't know if you want to add to this.
Yeah, I would just encourage you to think about whether or not you want to do the revision at the beginning of the year as a process to make sure that in September or August when your school year starts you have the current courses of study. Where this becomes problematic in a monitoring is if you have a monitoring early in the year but you haven't updated the IEP with the current course of study. So between last year to this year the student was in 10th grade and is now in 11th grade. That file gets pulled but you haven't updated with the 11th grade courses. So we know that the student's in 11th grade, but it seems like they're taking courses of study for 10th grade. So it really is up an LEA decision. Do you want to put your projected courses and have to revise just based on maybe one or two that might not end up being the course, or do you want to wait and do the revision? So again, it's your procedure.
Okay, so if you're good looking at the courses of study on or reflecting on the IEP that you have available, we can move on here. All right, so next we're going to hop into services and activities, and this is also goes along section 3 of the grid, and we'll get into that where they're at and located on the grid, what needs to be in there, and what is the difference between a service and activity. So here's just your file review questions. I'm not going to read those to you. Just take a look. It's just to make sure that there is a minimum of one service and one activity on the grid for each goal section. So there needs to be one service and one activity listed for post-secondary education and training, one service and activity listed for employment underneath employment goal, and if there is an independent, if the student does need an independent living goal, one service and one activity underneath that as well. Okay, so when we review this example, it's important to list all the services and activities being provided to the student within the grid. So when listing instructional services such as reading, math, behavior in the grid, you do not want to word the measurable annual goal as it is in the back, but do indicate what need is being addressed. So for example, when we're doing services are, they relate to the measurable annual goal. So I know in the past there's been confusion between services and activities, and the way to differentiate is services can be progress monitored. So services come from or represent a measurable annual goal or denote a measurable annual goal in the back of the IEP. So a service is what we're doing to increase a student's needs. So for this example here, we want to improve the skills. This student had a need in math, to increase math. So we want to improve skills in solving algebraic equations and inequalities. And that's just how you would put it there. Now, what we see sometimes when we're reviewing IEPs is folks will, or teachers will put in the full measurable annual goal in this section where the service is. You do not need to do that. You just need to put what area it is that the student needs increased need. In this case, it was math, and you could just put improved math skills. They went a little bit farther here and put improved skills in solving algebraic equations and inequalities. So when we're doing that, we don't have to write that full measurable annual goal in here. If you're having trouble deciding or figuring out what a service is, the best way to do that is go in the back to the measurable annual goals, and those are where you're going to pull your services from. So just pick one of the measurable annual goals, and then you can transfer whatever that need is that you're trying to improve through the service on the grid. Or you could go to the student's needs section in the present levels and use one of those that is denoted as a measurable annual goal. Okay, so the big thing here is services are need to be progress monitored, okay? Activities do not. So we'll get into activities in a second. But this is just an example of a service. Like I said before, compliance-wise, you only need one service, a minimum of one service underneath a goal. So in here is on the grid. So in this example, the post-secondary education and training goal, they have two services there. You could put as many services as you want under there, but you only need a minimum of one service and one activity. So there's your example of a service. And then for an example of an activity, as you can see here, the activity example is expand use of word processing graphic organizer software to complete assignments. Activities, there is thousands upon thousands of activities that you could do. The big thing here is make sure that you as an LEA, if you're writing it in there as an activity, that you can provide it. So an activity can pretty much be anything as long as it's helping the student to reach their post-secondary education goals. So in this example, they have to expand the use of word processing graphic organizer. Obviously, you want to make sure that the student is getting that service or activity, and also that you can provide it as an LEA. For example, I know this is an extreme example, but a student may come into your district from a rural district, and you're in the city, and out in the district where they had farmlands around, this student may have had a horse that they would ride on or something like that as an activity to prepare them for their post-secondary education goal. And the LEA in that rural area could provide that horse for the student to ride on. Now they come into the city, you guys don't have access to that. Obviously you want to change that because you cannot provide it. So make sure that you are being aware of that. Also, when you're going to, you want to be very broad in the activities such as an open, so you're not tying yourself to something. So a lot of times we'll see that, I know I've seen when reviewing IEPs where a student in the IEP says that the student will take a college visit to, you know, the University of Southern California. Is that really going to happen? You better make sure it's going to happen, because if somebody were to come in and say, hey, you know, you said you were going to take my student out for a college visit out to the University of Southern Cal, and that didn't happen, it really opens yourself up for some bad things there. So a way to do that is the student will visit, you know, take a college visit or visit colleges online, something like that. Just make sure that you can provide it. But an activity can be pretty much anything as long as it's helping the student reach their post-secondary goal. Okay, and as I mentioned, we went through this. This is a quick recap. So what are transition services and activities? They're action steps that support the student's movement towards post-secondary goal areas. They're slated to occur during the current IEP year, and each post-secondary goal area must have at least one service and at least one activity. You can have more than one, and that's up to you as an IEP team when writing the IEP, but you do not need, compliance-wise, you do not need more than one service in one activity. Okay, let me review the questions here before we move on. So one of the questions is, do specific goals need to be listed? Oh, I guess those were answered. Thank you. Hillary's answering those in our chat box, so I appreciate that, Hillary. And then listing services activities in the grid, like I said, just to recap, list all services and activities being provided to the student. When listing instructional services such as reading, math, and behavior, for example, in the grid, do not word as a measurable annual goal. Can't say that enough. That's actually a little more work for you as well. You just have to put the area of need that's being addressed or increased or attempt to be increased there when you're putting the service in, and then give credit for what's done in the general education setting. You don't need to list routine SDIs in the grid. Some people will start listing SDIs. You do not need to put SDIs in the grid. There is an SDI section for that. And you do not need to list the same activity under more than one post-secondary education goal area. And then here's just some example services, as we mentioned before. So these can be progress monitored, and services, when you're thinking about writing a service and activity into the grid, you have to think service, or, can I progress monitor it before moving forward with putting it in there. And there's some examples of activities, such as college visits, time management. Like I said, it could be anything. It could be, having a Army recruiter come in and speak with students, things like that. Just make sure that they're happening. That's the big thing. But they do not have to be progress monitored. They can happen once, they can happen multiple times. Just make sure they're happening. And just as again, like I said, hundreds and hundreds of things you can do for activities. Here's just some more as they're related to employment. I'm not going to read them all. Obviously, job shadowing, resume writing, military visits, work experience, things like that. And then independent living examples of activities, budgeting skills, help with photo registration, learning about transportation options, driver education. The list goes on and on. And then you just want to make sure that you're making the use of the transition activities that take place as part of the general ed curriculum, other school activities, and the guidance services. So you want to be sure to list in the transition grid as appropriate. And many districts map out activities by grade. So, depending on what in your LEA, what you do systemically, transition-wise, you may already have, a list of activities that are appropriate for certain grade levels, things like that. So, you don't have to, but, some LEAs have mapping guides that are a guide to their teachers and students and IEP teams when they're coming up with appropriate activities and things like that. And then we just want to make sure also that we address the location, frequency, projected beginning date, anticipated duration, and the people that will, or the person or agency that will be providing the activity or service. And you can see that right here in the grid where the arrow is pointing. I know it's pointing right at frequency, but it really means for that whole section of location, frequency, projected beginning date, anticipated duration, and person. Make sure those are filled out. Make sure that none of those are left blank or NA. Each of those will be checked during your special education audit to see if there's something in there. Okay, and so now I'm going to turn it over to our colleague in the East, Kim Cole, and she's going to cover the measurable annual goals and take us down and wrap us up.
Thanks,
Thank
Ryan. Okay, we're going to talk about step 5 in the IEP process, and that's to develop measurable annual goals that address skill deficits and lead to post-secondary goals. So as Ryan stated, these are the services within the IEP transition grid. Ryan, can you hit the next slide? Thanks. Okay, so the needs drive the skill development of the measurable annual goal. As an IEP team, prioritize these needs based on what the student will need to be more successful in their post-secondary goals. For students with more complex needs, they may have more than 3 to 5 measurable annual goals. However, it is suggested that there is only one measurable annual goal for each support area. The goals should accurately and reasonably project what the student will be able to obtain within the IEP year. In writing the measurable annual goals, begin with the baseline of the skill, and Hillary discussed that earlier. The baseline should be written within the present educational levels. So when writing the measurable annual goals, be sure to also include the performance criteria within each goal to enable progress monitoring to occur. And we will discuss that in depth a little later on. So measurable annual goals and objectives, they are not curriculum. So you do not want to list all the skills for 8th grade math. So we wouldn't say something like the student will be able to complete fractions, decimals, percents, or algebraic expressions. Measurable annual goals are not for subject areas. So again, we would not list gain fluency in a social studies or science class. They are not averages or passing a course. A goal would not state to receive at least a D in all subjects. They are not the activities. So we want to make sure that the activities for a student is just that. It's an activity. We are not progress monitoring. And I did skip one up here. We do not only address items that students are instructed in a special education classroom. So, and sometimes we might see that the student will achieve 80% when answering questions in a resource room. Okay? So again, just to review what measurable annual goals are not. They are not curriculum, subject areas, grades. They are not only for students instructed in a special education class, and they are not activities. Okay. As stated earlier, measurable annual goals are based on skill deficits and must build skills for students to access, participate, and make progress in the general curriculum and the life of the school and community. So the goals must focus on an area of need that will make the biggest difference to the students. When developing these goals, ask what specific skill should we target for instruction and measurement. Prioritize the skills that will have endurance, leverage, and necessity. These are the skills that should be addressed will allow the student to progress towards his or her post-secondary goals. Remember, the measurable annual goal and short-term objectives are looking at the skill deficit, and we are looking to build on the skills. When we think of skills, we know academic skills to be reading skills or math skills. So as Hillary stated earlier, we want to consider these skills like organizational skills, social skills, time management skills, dexterity skills, communication skills, self-help skills, travel skills, mobility, task-related skills, in order to support students in their independence. Self-determination and self-advocacy skills are important for all students. So let's make sure that we focus on this for all students. We want to make sure that these students have these skills or are working on them to prepare them for life after high school. Always keep in mind the individual student's needs when developing goals based on skills. A student in need of skill building related to communication may look very different depending on the needs of that individual student and will require different skill building goals. So what are the steps for developing a standards-aligned measurable annual goal? First, review present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Second, we want to identify the student's needs, academically and functional. Then we want to prioritize these needs as skills to be developed. Lastly, we want to determine the PA standard, the anchor, or the element from the curriculum framework that correlates with each need. After considering these steps, write the goal to include all required parts, a clearly defined action behavior, condition, and performance criteria, how well, how consistently, and how frequently progress will be monitored. So this slide provides questions to ask in the development of these required parts. What do you want the student to actually do to show the student is learning the skills? With what materials and under what conditions? How will we measure the skill and how often will we measure it? How well must the student perform the skill? How consistently must the skill be performed to demonstrate mastery? And what other assessments or forms of data will also indicate if the student is progressing towards this goal? It is often important to point out to teachers that the skill is something that can be used in the future to support post-secondary goals of the student. So it would not be okay to have a goal that says a student will raise his score from 70 to 80% or will score 7 out of 10 on a reading comprehension probe as the actual skill we want the student to master. That is really a performance criteria, not a skill. Reading a 7th grade level text with comprehension or solving algebraic expressions might be a skill we want the student to work on. So let's review what measurable annual goals require. There's 4 parts: the condition, student's name, clearly defined behavior, and performance criteria. We're going to do a little deeper dive into each of these. Part 1 of the measurable annual goal is the condition. The condition describes the situation the student will perform the behavior, the materials being used to evaluate learning, and may describe the setting for evaluation. The present education levels are used to help describe conditions under which the behavior is to be performed. When reviewing the condition section of the IEP, check to see that the goal describes when or under what conditions the behavior will take place, what the student will use to perform the behavior, and where the behavior will be observed or assessed. So some examples include during lunch breaks, using graphic organizers for writing assignments, given a 2-step direction, using an alarm feature on his cell phone. Those are the conditions. Part 2 of the annual goal is the student name. Although this should not be a problem, we must be very mindful if you're using the copy-paste feature to be sure that you are using the correct name and pronouns throughout the entire document. When you're sitting around the table with a parent, it becomes a very uncomfortable situation when you have the wrong name in the IEP. So please caution your teachers. Part 3 is your clearly defined behavior. When you are defining the behavior, it must be measurable and observable. Make sure that you're not using fuzzy words in this section. When developing these goals, ask the questions: is the behavior described as an action? Can it be described in terms of what the student will do? Can you close your eyes and visualize what the student will be doing? Can the behavior be observed? Some examples to clarify clearly defined behavior are that the student may say 5 out of the 10 vocabulary words, or the student may point to an item. Some non-examples would be the understand, or to know, or recognize. we are not able to clearly measure those, understanding, knowing, and recognizing the skill. Okay, part 4 is the performance criteria. This is where we see in IEPs where goals are missing one of these pieces. So there are 3 parts of the performance criteria. There is the criterion level, the number of times needed to demonstrate mastery, and the evaluation schedule. The criterion level is the functional performance level the student must demonstrate for mastery. 125 words per minute with 97% accuracy. That specifically tells me that the student needs to get 125 words in a minute at the 97%. That's mastery level. Very clear, concise. The number of times the student should demonstrate the criterion level is often forgotten when writing goals. So it's important because it specifies what is required to reach mastery. The evaluation schedule addresses how frequently the teacher plans to assess student mastery on the objective and the method by which the teacher will evaluate progress and/or completion of the goal. Note that monitoring progress once per quarter is not enough to evaluate if the student is making progress towards the goal. Performance criteria should set up testing situations for progress monitoring, and it should reflect the type of measurement that is meaningful for the skill. Some examples of language for performance criteria, we're going to look at that how well. If we're looking at rate, that's the fluency of a behavior and its relation to time expressed as a ratio. So if we're looking at appropriate behaviors, we might be looking at vocational tasks completed per minute or social interactions per hour. If we're looking at some inappropriate behaviors, it might be call-outs per class period. Another example of the how well would be a duration. The total amount of time in which a targeted behavior occurs in a specified observation. So this could be attending to a lesson, completion of a hygiene routine, maybe tantrums. Task analytic measurement is a record of the performance of each step in a sequence behavior comprising a task. So some behaviors we might look for could be making a bed or preparing a snack. Interval recording is a record of the occurrence of behavior within each segment of time, the intervals within a single observation. So any of the behaviors that we listed for frequency or duration could fit this as well. When using language for performance criteria, do not list end dates as part of that times of mastery. We want to be specific. 125 words per minute, 97% accuracy on 3 out of 5 random trials measured 2 times per week. And remember, quarterly is not enough. This slide here is a nice resource, your measurable at a glance. It provides a framework to assist professionals in writing their measurable annual goals. It can be used as a checklist to ensure all parts of the measurable annual goal are included. So now let's take a minute to reflect back. You have your IEP, and let's look at this file review prep guide. We're specifically looking in the area of Regulation 292B, transition services in the IEP that will reasonably enable the student to meet his or her post-secondary goals. So are the services addressing the skill deficits? Are we building skills to support students in achieving their post-secondary goals? So take about a minute now to just look at your transition grid and be sure that this area is checked yes or no, and if you're going to require some more professional development. So we'll take about a minute. So hopefully you were able to check yes for both boxes for your cyclical monitoring review. If not, you want to come up with a way to make sure that this is done for monitoring purposes. Okay, our next file review question is Regulation 292, where we're looking at the location, frequency, projected beginning date, anticipation date, and person's agency responsible for activity services. So although the Indicator 13 checklist doesn't include additional questions for location and frequency in these areas, it is important to be sure to include the most accurate information and note that the person responsible can't be the parent or student alone. It must be under the supervision of the LEA personnel. So it must, if you're going to have parent as somebody who's going to be responsible for an activity or a service, you also must have the special education teacher or somebody from the LEA. It cannot fall solely on a parent or on a student. For the services and activities, you want to make sure that these are evidenced in the grid. Is it clear as to who is delivering these services and activities and at what frequency and during what duration? So take about another minute just to quickly look at your IEP and see how you score. Let's take a look at the next regulation, 292C. Annual goals are related to the student's transition services. This is referencing the measurable annual goals supporting the student's post-secondary goals. Is or are there annual IEP goals related to the student's transition needs? This reflects to the alignment of the IEP. Another way of looking at this, do the services in the transition grid relate to the student's post-secondary goals? Will these services help the student in achieving their post-secondary goals? So as Ryan stated earlier, we just want to caution you, when you're listing instructional services, the reading, math, or behavior in the grid, do not word it as a measurable annual goal, but do indicate what need is being addressed. For example, you do not want to write the entire 5-part measurable annual goal in the grid. Rather, it is, if it's a math goal based on improving comprehension, you would write improve math computation skills in the grid. So take about another 30 seconds to see, do you have measurable annual goals listed in your grid? Step 6 of the IEP process, monitoring measurable annual goals and adjusting as needed. So it is important that when we progress monitor goals, that they need to be clear and measurable. So we must have clear and measurable present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. This means there should be assessments, progress monitoring, baselines, and needs identified. When we talk about alignment, so what does that mean? This means that we are stating that the IEP should tell the story of where the child is now, where they want to go, and what needs to be done to get them there, including goals and supports services. So on the next slide, we have a nice visual that takes us through this. Remember to start with clear and measurable present education levels. These clear and measurable educational levels identify its needs that must be addressed. The services and activities are included in the transition grid to help the student in achieving his or her post-secondary goals. The measurable annual goals are specific areas of skill deficit where targeted instruction and monitoring will occur, again, to support the student in achieving their post-secondary goals. Lastly, the monitoring of the skill ensures the student is progressing towards their goal. So those are the 6 steps in the IEP process. Now we're going to go into the transition resources. So if the next couple slides talk about the Indicator 13 Compliance Module Series. This was a training series developed by Patton and the Intermediate Unit Secondary transition consultants in response to the accountability requirements under the Individuals with Disability Education Act of 2004. The module highlights effective practices in secondary transition. The series is designed to provide an overview of the 7 areas required for Indicator 13 for compliant secondary transition practices. They each contain a pre-test, a PowerPoint, and effective practices Q&A. These can be found on our patent website. So as you'll see on this slide and the next slide, the 6 modules are described. The next resource that we have is the Secondary Transition Directory. This is where you'll find contact information for your regional, local, intermediate unit, transition TAC, and regional patent transition consultants. This is being updated for the 2019-20 school year, and it will be on the website in the future. So keep your eyes out for this, because this is another helpful tool. The following 2 slides, and I want to be mindful of our time here, the following 2 slides have additional resources related to transition and transition programming. These resources are helpful for youth, young adults, families, and professionals in providing resources to support students in achieving their post-secondary goals. Please take some time to familiarize yourself with these resources in order to support transition age programming. So we have 6 or 7 resources on here that are really helpful for all parties involved in the transition planning. So at this time, I'm going to turn this over to Hillary and or Ryan. If we have any questions, I know there's been some questions coming through the chat.
Hi, Kim. Yep, the questions were specific to sections that were before, and we kind of had been answering them as we went, so there don't seem to be any on the content that you presented. But I will say, if you go to the next slide, Ryan, the contact information for Kim and Ryan and I is available in the PowerPoint. So if you think of questions as you leave today's webinar, or if you re-listen to the webinar when we post the recording, feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions. As always, your regional patent consultants are here to support you through the process, but also you have your IU transition TAC that could be available to you as a support in terms of reaching out to them prior to your monitoring. There may be some technical assistance that they can provide using the Indicator 13 checklist, or even some consultation that they can provide to help you get on track for your monitoring. We wish you all the very best of luck as you go through your monitoring this year. We hope to see this year's cohort's data closer to, if not at 100%. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Take care, everybody. Thank you.